You don't end up alone because something is wrong with you. You end up alone because at some point you started noticing what others ignore, and once that awareness turns on, it doesn't switch off again. At first, it feels small, almost harmless. You notice tone changes in people's voices. You notice words that don't fully match actions. You notice how quickly emotions are performed and how rarely they are actually felt. And you don't consciously decide anything at that moment, but something inside you quietly recalibrates. You start seeing too much to experience things the same way again. People around you don't notice this shift immediately. They just feel you becoming slightly more quiet, slightly more observant, slightly harder to fully read, but inside you, the experience of connection has already changed. It stops being simple. It starts feeling like interpretation. Every conversation begins to carry layers. Every interaction starts requiring mental translation before emotional presence can fully happen, and that creates something strange. You are physically present, but mentally slightly ahead of everything, always processing, always reading, always analyzing what is being said and what is being avoided. At first, you try to stay the same. You try to participate naturally, to not overthink, to just exist in conversations the way others do. You even adjust yourself slightly. You soften your perception. You reduce your internal analysis just to feel more normal in social spaces. But that only works temporarily because awareness doesn't disappear just because you stop paying attention to it. It stays in the background, quietly observing everything you try not to notice. And slowly, without any dramatic moment, you begin to feel a distance that is hard to explain. Not distance from people exactly, but distance from the ease that other people seem to experience with people. You start feeling like there is an invisible layer between you and everyone else, not because you are excluded, but because you are processing things at a different depth. And that depth starts becoming isolating, not because it is painful, but because it is rarely shared. What most people don't understand is that intelligence doesn't just mean thinking more. It means processing multiple layers of reality at the same time. You don't just hear words, you automatically sense intent behind them. You don't just observe behavior, you unconsciously map patterns behind it. You don't just live moments, you analyze them while they are happening. And when this becomes your default way of experiencing life, simplicity starts disappearing from social connection. And when simplicity disappears, connection starts requiring effort. Not physical effort, but emotional translation. You start translating your thoughts into simpler versions so others can meet them. And that translation slowly becomes tiring. Not because people are exhausting, but because filtering your inner world constantly makes you feel slightly removed from it. So you begin to withdraw, not loudly, not intentionally, but gradually. You stop over-explaining, you stop oversharing, you stop opening every layer of your thinking, because opening every layer doesn't always lead to being understood. And somewhere in that process, something subtle happens. You start predicting people, not in a supernatural way, but through pattern recognition. You begin sensing where conversations are going before they reach there. You begin anticipating emotional responses before they appear. You begin recognizing familiar social scripts repeating in different faces. And at first, this feels like clarity, even strength. But over time, it removes surprise from connection. And without surprise, connection starts feeling less like discovery and more like repetition. That is where loneliness quietly changes form. It is no longer about being physically alone or socially disconnected. It becomes about being slightly ahead of every interaction you are in. And when you are always ahead, nothing ever fully meets you in real time. Everything feels slightly delayed, slightly predictable, slightly already understood before it arrives. And that creates a very specific kind of isolation that is hard to explain to anyone who doesn't experience it. But underneath all of this, there is something even deeper that most people miss. This is not only intelligence, this is adaptation. At some point in your life, you likely learned that full expression does not always lead to full understanding. Maybe your emotions were misunderstood, maybe your depth was dismissed, maybe your sensitivity was treated as something excessive rather than real. And your mind quietly recorded that experience not as pain, but as information. Information that says being fully open is not always safe. So you adapted. You learned to observe more than you reveal. You learned to think more than you speak. You learned to understand more than you express. And over time, this adaptation became your personality from the outside, but inside it remained a protection mechanism, because distance feels safer than misinterpretation. Control feels safer than vulnerability. Predictability feels safer than emotional risk. But every adaptation comes with a cost, and the cost here is closeness, because closeness requires something that your system has become careful with: unfiltered visibility. And unfiltered visibility feels dangerous when your experience has repeatedly shown that being fully seen does not guarantee being fully understood. So instead of risking that mismatch again, you begin choosing emotional control. You don't disappear from people. You just stop fully entering situations where misunderstanding feels possible. And that is where the misunderstanding deepens. From the outside, people see someone who is calm, observant, sometimes distant. From the inside, you are constantly processing, constantly analyzing, constantly adjusting how much of yourself should be expressed in order to stay safe and stable in interaction. And over time, that internal adjustment becomes automatic. You no longer decide how open you are, you just default to measured exposure. The strange part is that even with all this distance, you still crave depth. That part never shuts off. You still feel drawn to conversations that go beyond surface level. You still feel something missing in shallow interactions. You still recognize instantly when a moment has potential to become meaningful. But now, instead of fully entering those moments, you hesitate. Not because you don't want depth, but because you've learned how often depth does not continue into understanding. So you start expecting less. Not because your desire disappears, but because your expectations learn to protect you from disappointment. And slowly that protection becomes identity. You start believing that this is just how you are. Someone who sees too much, feels slightly apart, operates at a different distance from people. But that belief is only partially true, because what looks like permanent distance is often just repeated hesitation layered over time. And something important starts to reveal itself if you look closely enough. You are not disconnected from people. You are disconnected from sustained recognition, recognition that does not fade after initial interaction, recognition that continues even after complexity appears, recognition that does not require you to reduce yourself in order to be understood. But because you rarely experience that kind of recognition consistently, your mind begins assuming it is rare everywhere. And that assumption shapes how quickly you withdraw, how carefully you reveal, how cautiously you participate. You start leaving emotionally before relationships have enough time to evolve into something deeper. And from the outside, that looks like self-sufficiency, but internally it feels more like early retreat. Yet, even in this pattern, something remains unchanged. You still notice depth instantly when it appears. Even a small moment of genuine understanding feels different to you. It interrupts your internal noise, it creates stillness in your awareness. It feels like alignment instead of analysis. And that reaction itself is important, because it proves that your system is not closed, it is simply selective and cautious. And slowly, if something shifts over time, it is not your intelligence, not your awareness, not your depth. It is your assumption that being understood must happen instantly or not at all. Because in reality, understanding is not always immediate. Sometimes it is built through repetition, patience, and gradual exposure of who you are. But when you have been misunderstood enough times, patience becomes the first thing you abandon, even with people who might have eventually understood you. So the cycle continues. Distance creates misunderstanding, misunderstanding reinforces distance, and both sides believe they are responding correctly. But cycles are not identities. They are patterns that repeat until something interrupts them. An interruption does not mean becoming less aware or less deep. It means becoming slightly more open to pacing instead of immediacy, slightly more willing to allow people time instead of expecting instant alignment. Because not everyone who fails to understand you quickly is incapable of understanding you deeply. Some people simply need time that you no longer give easily. And when you stop assuming instant mismatch and start allowing gradual connection, something subtle changes. You begin to notice that depth is not always missed, it is often just delayed. And in that realization, loneliness stops being a fixed conclusion about who you are. It becomes a signal about timing, environment, and patience, not a permanent identity, but a temporary experience shaped by how quickly you allow yourself to be fully known.